Wealthy people have a fundamental, almost terminal misunderstanding of what real power actually looks like. They genuinely believe that authority is something you wear. They think it manifests as a cream-colored silk scarf, a pair of spotless white slacks, and a freshly manicured hand holding an imported leather folder. They assume power announces itself loudly, demanding attention, expecting immediate compliance simply because it has a high credit limit and a title on a neighborhood committee. I spent the last 15 years of my life proving them wrong. Before I retired early, my profession was corporate liquidation. I was the guy the bank sent in when a multi-million-dollar empire collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. My entire career was built on walking into boardrooms filled with executives wearing $5,000 suits, looking them in the eye, and quietly pointing out the single, fatal loophole in their contracts that stripped them of everything they owned. I learned a long time ago that true power doesn't scream. It doesn't need a uniform. Real power is completely silent. Real power looks like a man in a faded flannel shirt and dusty work boots, quietly holding the original, notarized deed to the ground you are currently standing on. The knock echoed through $34 million of empty, imported Italian marble like a warning shot fired by someone obsessed with manners. I was standing in the center of the grand foyer. There was drywall dust caked onto the knees of my denim jeans. A yellow carpenter's pencil was tucked behind my ear, and the sharp, chemical smell of fresh primer hung heavy in the cool morning air blowing in from the Pacific Ocean. Then came the sound again. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a friendly knock. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic thud of a delivery driver or the polite rap of a neighbor dropping by to introduce themselves. It was a sharp, tiny strike from something metallic against the reinforced glass of the custom front door. It was precise, deeply impatient, and entirely condescending. It was the sound of someone who fundamentally believed that the house itself should open faster just because they were the one standing outside. Behind me, morning sunlight poured through 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling architectural windows, turning the thick clouds of construction dust hovering in the air into a shimmering cloud of gold. Beyond the sprawling back terrace, the ocean rolled under a gray, overcast sky. It looked quiet, vast, and impossibly expensive. Exactly the way everything inside the gates of Seacliff Point Estates was legally mandated to look. I wiped a streak of white plaster off my hands onto my shirt, took a slow breath, and pulled open the heavy oak door. 3 people stood on the front landing, arranged in a perfect triangle of manufactured authority. To the left stood a private security guard wrapped in a crisp navy blue tactical jacket. He looked rigid, his eyes scanning the foyer, looking for a threat, but only finding a renovation. To the right stood a remarkably thin man in expensive leather loafers, his head bowed as he clutched a sleek silver tablet like it was a shield. And standing front and center was Margaret Ellison, president of the Seacliff Point Homeowners Association. Her silver blonde hair was tucked immaculately beneath that cream scarf. Her white slacks defied the concept of dirt, and wrapped tightly in her right hand, featuring perfectly painted red fingernails, was a heavy metal designer pen, the exact instrument she had just used to tap against my glass. Margaret did not say hello. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask how my morning was going. Instead, she performed a slow, agonizingly deliberate visual sweep of my entire body. Her eyes started at the steel toes of my scuffed boots, traveled up the dust-covered denim, lingered on the smear of white primer on my sleeve, and finally settled on my face. Her jaw tightened. Her expression shifted into that highly specific brand of polite, sanitized disgust that extremely wealthy people reserve for problems they firmly believe the hired help should have already handled. Who authorized you to be inside this residence? She asked the question smoothly. Her voice was perfectly calm, carefully modulated, and yet it projected through the cavernous marble foyer as if she personally owned the acoustic rights to the air inside the house. I didn't answer her immediately. I didn't get defensive. When you spend a decade tearing down corporate structures, you learn to let the silence hang. Silence makes arrogant people uncomfortable. It makes them want to fill the void with more words, and words are just evidence waiting to be recorded. Instead of speaking, I simply looked past her shoulder. I looked out at the massive circular driveway paved with imported cobblestone. I looked at the aggressively manicured privacy hedges that cost more annually than most people make in a decade. I looked down the long, winding hill toward the private security gate, where the solid brass Seacliff Point sign gleamed softly in the coastal marine layer. Parked right next to the grand, tiered water fountain in the center of the driveway was my truck. A 10-year-old, matte black Ford F-250 with heavy aluminum ladders strapped to the utility rack. It sat there bleeding oil onto the pristine cobblestones, looking gloriously, unapologetically out of place among the neighborhood's fleet of leased German sports cars and custom-painted golf carts. That battered Ford truck had fooled her. The scuffed boots had fooled her. The drywall dust had done the rest of the heavy lifting. My name is Bennett Hayes. I am 41 years old. I grew up in the suffocating heat of Bakersfield, watching my father frame houses until the cartilage in his knees completely dissolved. I watched my mother scrub the toilets of rental units between tenants, teaching me early on that the absolute fastest way to understand the structural integrity of a building or a person is to look incredibly closely at the things the rich try to cover up with fresh paint. I started as a framing carpenter when I was 19. I learned the anatomy of real estate from the inside out, staring at the raw bones of buildings. When I transitioned into asset liquidation, I used that same blue-collar intuition to tear apart corporate portfolios. I didn't flip houses for television cameras. I bought distressed, toxic, financially cancerous properties that terrified other investors. I fixed them, I held them, and I quietly built a net worth that didn't require me to wear a suit ever again. I am the sole legal owner of the 21,000-square-foot legacy coastal residence Margaret was currently trying to throw me out of. But Margaret didn't know that yet. Or, more accurately, Margaret's brain simply could not process the visual data in front of her. To her, ownership came with a mandatory dress code. This estate had been sitting totally vacant, rotting quietly in the salt air, for almost 3 full years before I bought it through a heavily shielded private trust. The glossy real estate listing had called it a legacy coastal residence. My lead contractor took one look at the crumbling retaining walls and called it a money pit with a nice view. I called it the greatest contractual loophole I had ever found in my life. I had been on site since 4 in the morning, ripping open the drywall in the library because a project manager swore the moisture barrier was intact. In my experience, when someone wearing a polo shirt tells you the structural integrity is perfect, it usually means they were simply too lazy to check behind the baseboards. Margaret lifted her chin a fraction of an inch, drawing the thin man with the tablet to attention. We received a priority report of unauthorized labor entering the property outside of approved community hours, she stated, her tone shifting from inquiry to absolute decree. Seacliff Point is a strictly private community. All manual workers must be cleared through the main gate and physically supervised by the verified owner or a designated, credentialed representative. To her left, Daniel, the security guard, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, but his posture remained obedient. The thin man in the loafers furiously tapped something into the glass screen of his tablet, documenting my existence as a violation. The ocean breeze pushed past them, carrying the sharp scent of eucalyptus from the landscaping. It mixed with the faint, briny smell of the sea, but beneath all of it, I could still smell the wet primer on my clothes. I looked Margaret directly in the eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't change my posture. I just asked one, highly specific, legally binding question. Are you currently ordering me to leave this house? Margaret's eyes flicked sideways, glancing at the security guard for a fraction of a second to ensure her physical backup was in place, before snapping back to me. Her confidence was absolute. Until the real owner can be contacted and your presence here verified, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. Yes, you need to step outside and vacate the residence immediately. The real owner. The words hung in the vast, empty foyer. They were clean, ugly, and entirely actionable. What Margaret didn't know was that my smartphone was sitting on the makeshift plywood workbench 10 feet behind me, and the screen was fully illuminated. The voice memo app was already 3 minutes deep into a recording. Furthermore, the hardwired security camera mounted directly above the crystal chandelier had a perfect, unobstructed downward view of her standing inside the threshold. And the temporary, battery-operated construction camera tucked discreetly in the corner beside a stack of Italian tile samples was blinking a steady, rhythmic blue light. I looked down at the imported marble floor. Then, I looked at the dusty, white footprints my boots had left across the stone. She truly believed she had caught a rat scurrying through a palace. She thought she had found someone who did not belong, someone easily intimidated by a clipboard and a uniform. What she had actually found was the man who held the keys to the front door, the deed to the entire cliffside, Crucially, the legal title to the asphalt road her shiny golf cart was currently parked on. I didn't argue with her. I didn't reach for my wallet to pull out an ID. I didn't explain the intricacies of a blind trust. Instead, I simply took one slow, deliberate step backward into the house. I moved just far enough to ensure that Margaret, the security guard, and the man with the tablet were perfectly, undeniably framed within the visual field of every single camera in the room. I was going to let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. Margaret took a deliberate half-step over the threshold. It was a calculated microaggression. In the world of corporate restructuring, I used to see this exact physical maneuver all the time. A failing CEO pacing at the head of a mahogany boardroom table, stepping just a little too close, trying to use their physical presence to compensate for the fact that their balance sheet was bleeding out. Margaret was doing the exact same thing. She was using the architecture of my foyer to project an authority she didn't actually possess. She snapped open the imported leather folder she was carrying. The sound was sharp, like a miniature gunshot in the quiet, empty house. With her manicured fingers, she extracted a single sheet of heavy stock paper, printed on official Seacliff Point letterhead. This is a formal notice of temporary removal from community property, pending owner verification, she announced. She held the paper out toward me, expecting me to take it, expecting me to reflexively obey the physical command. I didn't move my hands. I kept them resting loosely at my sides, the drywall dust catching the morning light. "I'm not taking that," I said quietly. Margaret's smile tightened into a thin, bloodless line. "Whether you physically take the document or not is irrelevant. You are currently in violation of gate security protocol, homeowners association authority, and community safety guidelines. Until the authorized representative of this estate confirms your presence, you must vacate." Now, listen to those phrases. Gate security protocol, community safety guidelines. No legal citations. No municipal codes. No actual law. Just expensive-sounding syllables strung together to create the illusion of jurisdiction. It was a fascinating linguistic trick. I had dismantled entire hedge funds built on that exact same type of empty vocabulary. People use big words when their position is incredibly small. I shifted my gaze from Margaret to the security guard standing nervously on the landing. "What's your name?" I asked him. Margaret immediately turned her head, her silk scarf fluttering slightly. She was deeply irritated that I had bypassed her to address the hired help. "You do not need to interrogate the security staff. You need to." I asked him a question, I said, my voice dropping an octave, stripping away the polite neutrality. I looked directly at the guard. "What is your name?" The guard swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed above the collar of his tactical jacket. He was caught between his paycheck and his instincts, and right now, his instincts were screaming that something about this scenario was fundamentally, dangerously wrong. "Daniel Ross, sir," he finally answered. "Daniel," I said smoothly. "You were working the main gate this morning. Who logged my entry at exactly 5:42 a.m.? Daniel reached for the heavy tactical smartphone holstered on his belt. His thumb moved quickly across the screen, pulling up the morning access logs for the estate. Margaret let out a short, dismissive sigh. "Contractors frequently share access codes, Mr. Ross. It proves absolutely nothing other than the fact that our security needs to be drastically tightened regarding unauthorized vendor entry." I ignored her. I kept my eyes entirely on Daniel. "Read the log, Daniel." "Who issued the clearance code?" Daniel stared at the glowing screen of his device. I watched his facial expression change. It was a subtle shift, a slight widening of the eyes, a fraction of an inch of slack in his jaw. It was the exact expression an auditor makes when they find the hidden offshore account that proves the company is a total fraud. "The entry code," Daniel started, his voice suddenly lacking any of its previous professional confidence. He cleared his throat. "The code was generated by the owner portal, primary account holder." The foyer went dead silent. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic crashing of the Pacific waves against the cliffs below the back terrace. I looked at Margaret. The multi-million-dollar digital security system she relied upon to enforce her iron grip on the neighborhood had just officially recognized me as the apex authority right in front of her face. Most normal, rational human beings would have paused in that moment. They would have taken a breath. They would have asked a clarifying question, entertaining the slight, terrifying possibility that they had made a colossal, embarrassing mistake. But Margaret Ellison was not a rational human being. She was a narcissist entirely addicted to her own manufactured prestige. And a narcissist cannot retreat. Her psychological recovery took less than 3 seconds. Owner portal access can easily be mismanaged or delegated inappropriately to subcontractors. Margaret countered smoothly, though I noticed her knuckles were turning white where she gripped the leather folder. It certainly does not establish legal ownership of a 21,000 square foot legacy estate. Furthermore, you are not wearing proper vendor identification. To her right, Arthur Bell, the tragically thin HOA treasurer, nodded vigorously. Exactly. Protocol must be followed. Perhaps there was a software glitch at the main gate. He tapped his tablet as if trying to physically delete the reality of the situation. Let's bypass the software then, I suggested. I took a deliberate step toward the makeshift plywood workbench behind me, turning my back on them for a brief, calculated moment. Daniel, you have the contact information for the registered owner of this estate in your security database, correct? The Hayes Coastal Trust. Yes, sir. It's listed in the primary emergency contact file. Call it. Margaret's eyes narrowed into slits. What kind of game are you playing? No game, Margaret. You want the owner to verify my presence. So, have your guard call the owner. Right now. Margaret stared at me, her mind frantically trying to run the calculus of the situation. She was looking for the trap, but couldn't see the wires. She turned to Daniel and gave a curt, arrogant nod. Make the call, Mr. Ross. Let's get this over with so we can properly secure the property. Daniel tapped a sequence on his screen and raised the phone to his ear. 2 seconds later, a harsh, metallic buzzing sound shattered the quiet of the marble foyer. It was coming from the plywood workbench. My smartphone, lying face up next to a roll of blue painter's tape and a dusty tape measure, was vibrating violently against the raw wood. The screen was brilliantly illuminated. Nobody moved. We all just stood there, breathing in the smell of fresh primer, listening to the phone buzz. It rang once, twice, 3 times. The sound bounced off the 30-foot ceilings, wrapping around Margaret Ellison like a slowly tightening noose. I walked over to the workbench. I didn't rush. I picked up the phone, swiped to silence the ringer, and slowly turned the screen around so Margaret, Arthur, and Daniel could see it clearly. In bold, bright letters, the caller ID read, Seacliff Point Main Security Gate. I didn't say a single word. I just held my arm out, letting the electronic evidence burn itself into her retinas. I watched the exact moment the illusion of her supremacy shattered. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing deflation. For a split second, Margaret's perfectly curated mask slipped, revealing not apology, not humility, but pure, unfiltered panic. She wasn't asking herself if she was wrong. She was a seasoned social predator. She was rapidly calculating how much of this humiliation was currently being recorded by the blinking blue light of the construction camera in the corner. I set the phone back down on the plywood. You have now officially contacted the primary representative of the Hayes Coastal Trust, I said, my voice devoid of any warmth, any forgiveness. Are you still ordering me to vacate my own residence? Arthur Bell actually took a physical step backward, bumping his shoulder against the heavy oak door. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the train tracks and the whistle was blowing. Daniel immediately dropped his phone back into his holster and stared rigidly at his own boots, completely removing himself from the chain of command. But Margaret was trapped in the corner of her own ego. She had brought security. She had brought a board member. She had printed a formal notice. To apologize now would be to admit catastrophic failure in front of her subordinates. So, she doubled down. She pivoted to the only weapon she had left, aesthetic snobbery. This is highly irregular, Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly, completely devoid of the smooth acoustics she had commanded 5 minutes earlier. Ownership structured through a blind trust must be properly verified through the Management Council's legal channels. And frankly, Mr. Hayes, if that is indeed your name, this community has strict standards. The owners here expect absolute discretion. Unauthorized-looking vehicles dripping oil on the cobblestones and irregular construction behavior severely impact the property values of the entire neighborhood. I almost smiled. It was beautiful, even when confronted with absolute, undeniable proof that she had unlawfully trespassed and attempted to illegally evict a homeowner. She couldn't bring herself to apologize. She simply changed the accusation from trespassing to being inconvenient to her eyeballs. She thought she could still win by shifting the goalposts. She didn't realize the game was already over. Standards, I repeated softly. You want to talk about the standards of this community. You want to talk about legal verification. I reached under the plywood workbench and grabbed the heavy, reinforced canvas project bag I carried to every job site. I hoisted it up and dropped it onto the wood with a heavy, definitive thud. I unzipped the top and reached inside. Margaret watched my hands carefully, her chin raised in a final, desperate attempt at defiance. She probably thought I was going to pull out a printed copy of the deed, or maybe a bank statement to prove I belonged. She had no idea that a deed was merely a piece of paper. I was about to pull out a guillotine. "Let's verify everything, Margaret," I said, pulling a massive, black leather binder from the canvas bag. "Because you just made the biggest mistake of your entire tenure as president. There is a very specific, undeniable psychological weight to a massive, black leather binder hitting a wooden table. In the world of corporate liquidation, I learned that middle management absolutely terrifies of binders. A binder means someone has done the reading. A binder means someone has kept the receipts. When I dropped that canvas bag onto the plywood and pulled out the thick leather folder, I didn't look at Margaret. I looked at Arthur Bell, the tragically thin HOA treasurer. Arthur was the numbers guy. He was the one who had to balance the books and answer to the insurance companies. And the moment that binder hit the wood, Arthur stopped tapping his silver tablet. He knew, with the primal instinct of an accountant, that whatever was inside those black leather covers was going to be expensive. I flipped the binder open. The metal rings clicked loudly in the echoing foyer. "Let's start with the basics," I said, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. I peeled back the clear plastic sleeve on the first page. "This is the official trust certificate, filed with the county clerk 31 days ago. It names me, Bennett Hayes, as the sole managing trustee and primary beneficiary." I didn't hand the paper to Margaret. I simply turned the binder 90 degrees so it faced her directly. She didn't lean in to read it. She kept her posture rigidly upright, her chin tilted toward the ceiling, refusing to acknowledge the physical evidence. Anyone with a laser printer and a rudimentary understanding of legal formatting can produce a fake certificate, Margaret scoffed. Her voice was slightly louder now, pushing back against the silence of the room. "I am not a bank teller, Mr. Hayes. I do not verify random paperwork presented by unapproved contractors in a dusty room." I nodded slowly. It was the exact response I expected. A failing executive will always attack the validity of the audit before they attack the numbers themselves. "Fair enough," I replied, turning the page. "Let's move past the trust. This is the grant deed. Stamped. Notarized. Countersigned by the title company." I turned another page. "This is the $2 million builder's risk insurance binder. And this is the Coastal Development Clearance Permit, approved by the City Planning Commission, which, incidentally, lists my personal cell phone number as the mandatory emergency contact." Arthur leaned forward. He couldn't help himself. He squinted at the seal of the title company on the grant deed. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously. He recognized the watermark. He knew it was real. "Margaret," Arthur whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the ocean breeze rattling the plastic sheeting upstairs. "The seal is authentic. He is the owner." Margaret snapped her head toward him, her eyes flashing with venom. "Do not be ridiculous, Arthur. Even if he is the owner, that does not excuse his blatant disregard for the rules of this community. He still circumvented the gate protocol. He still looks like a vagrant. He still caused a security disturbance." She turned back to me, her chest heaving slightly under her silk blouse. She was preparing to launch into a monologue about HOA bylaws and neighborhood aesthetics. She was preparing to try and win the argument on a technicality of manners. "I am not done," I interrupted her. The words were soft, but they cut through her momentum like a scalpel. I flipped past the deeds, past the insurance policies, and past the renovation permits. I went all the way to the back of the binder, pulling out an oversized, folded piece of heavy architectural paper. I unfolded it meticulously, smoothing the creases flat against the plywood workbench. "As a former asset liquidator, I have a very specific hobby," I explained, looking down at the intricate web of black lines and tiny numbers. "Whenever I evaluate a distressed property, I don't just look at the foundation. I look at the history. I look at what everyone else assumes is permanent, and I check the bolts." I tapped the center of the paper. "This is the original parcel survey. The title map. It was drawn up in 1970, long before Seacliff Point was a gated community. Long before your homeowners association ever existed." Arthur took a hesitant step closer. Daniel, the security guard, remained perfectly still, but his eyes were locked on the map. "Notice the red boundary line," I said, tracing my finger along a thick, red marker line that outlined my 21,000 square foot estate. "It encompasses the cliff, the back terrace, the footprint of this house. The circular driveway. I paused. I let my finger travel slowly down the red line, moving away from the house, tracing a path down the topographical slope of the map. And then, I continued, my voice dropping to a dead, clinical whisper. The boundary line extends outward. It forms a sharp, triangular wedge right at the bottom of the hill. Arthur gasped. It was a small, sharp intake of air, but in that quiet foyer, it sounded like a siren. He saw it. The treasurer finally saw the fatal loophole. What is he talking about, Arthur? Margaret demanded, her voice sharp with sudden, unexplainable anxiety. She hated being left out of a realization. She hated not knowing what the men in the room were looking at. I didn't let Arthur answer. I wanted to deliver the execution myself. This wedge of land, Margaret, I said, tapping the bottom corner of the map. This highly specific, perfectly landscaped piece of asphalt and cobblestone. It belongs to this parcel. It is legally attached to this house. It is owned entirely and exclusively by the Hayes Coastal Trust. I looked up from the map and met her eyes. That wedge of land, I said slowly, emphasizing every single syllable, is the exact piece of ground where your grand security gate is currently built. It is the cobblestone turnaround lane. It is the landscaped median where your solid brass Seacliff Point sign sits. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The pristine white slacks and the cream-colored scarf suddenly looked absurdly inadequate against the sheer weight of property law. That's impossible, she finally stammered, shaking her head. The HOA built that gate 20 years ago. We maintain it. We pave it. We own the entrance to this community. You don't own a single inch of it, I corrected her coldly. The previous owner of this estate, the man who let this house rot for 3 years, granted the HOA a temporary operational easement. A license to use his land to operate your little security checkpoint. Temporary agreements, Margaret, are like old beach stairs. They look permanent. They feel solid, right up until the moment someone checks the hardware. I reached into the binder one last time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This is the temporary access agreement, I said. And if you look right here at the bottom, you will see the expiration clause. It expired 18 months ago. The previous owner never bothered to renew it. And your highly paid management company apparently forgot to check. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and utterly destructive. You don't have a security gate, Margaret, I said softly. You have a trespassing violation on my private property. And this morning, you used a security system operating illegally on my land to dispatch an armed guard to try and forcibly remove me from my own living room. Arthur Bell looked like he was going to be physically sick. As the treasurer, his brain was instantly calculating the legal exposure. He was visualizing the multi-million-dollar lawsuits for harassment, unauthorized entry, and land use violations. He realized, with terrifying clarity, that I could legally erect a chain-link fence across their beautiful gated entrance by noon, trapping every single multi-million-dollar luxury vehicle inside the neighborhood. Daniel, the security guard, made the first move. He didn't say a word. He simply took 2 large, deliberate steps backward. His boots crossed the marble threshold, leaving the interior of my house and stepping firmly onto the exterior porch. He was a professional. He knew exactly what it meant to act as an enforcer on private property without jurisdiction. By stepping outside, he was formally resigning from Margaret's imaginary army. Margaret stood completely frozen. Her eyes darted wildly between the title map on the table, Arthur's pale, sweating face, and the empty space where her security guard used to be. The entire foundation of her identity, her control over the neighborhood, her ability to dictate who belonged and who didn't, was collapsing around her in real time. Mr. Hayes, Arthur squeaked, his voice cracking under the pressure. I assure you, we can verify these documents with our legal counsel. I'm sure there is a misunderstanding. We can negotiate an extension. You are welcome to verify anything you want, I said, picking up my phone from the plywood workbench. But you will do it from outside my house. I used the exact word Margaret had used 20 minutes earlier. But this time, it wasn't an arrogant assumption. It was an eviction notice backed by the county clerk. Margaret Ellison smoothed her silk scarf with 2 trembling fingers. It was a pathetic, highly controlled gesture, the kind of movement people make when the floor drops out from under them and they desperately want their hands to look busy. She gathered her leather folder and her printed removal notice, clutching them to her chest like a life preserver. She backed out of the doorway. She didn't turn around. She just retreated, step by agonizing step, until her pristine white shoes were standing on the front porch next to the guard. Arthur practically sprinted after her, his expensive loafers slipping slightly on the damp stone landing. I walked slowly toward the front of the foyer. I didn't slam the heavy oak door. I didn't need to. I pushed it shut slowly, deliberately, letting the heavy brass latch click into place with a sound that felt incredibly, beautifully final. The house went completely quiet. The ocean kept rolling outside the glass. I stood there in the dust, looking at the blinking blue light of the security camera in the corner. I had all the footage. I had the audio. I had the gate logs. Margaret thought she was coming to clean up a mess. She didn't realize she had just handed a corporate liquidator the matches to burn her entire empire to the ground. I picked up my phone and dialed my attorney. It was time to send the bill. In my former line of work, we had a very specific rule about applying leverage. Never do it yourself if you can pay a professional to do it colder. I didn't march down to the HOA clubhouse to demand an apology. I didn't knock on Margaret's door to gloat. I simply stood in the quiet, dusty foyer of my newly secured 21,000 square foot estate, looked out at the ocean, and called my attorney. Her name is Laura. She is a senior partner at a firm that specializes in brutal, high-stakes property litigation. She has the remarkably calm, flat voice of a woman who charges $800 an hour because panic is a free, entirely useless emotion. I explained the events of the morning. I described the red notice. I described the security guard. And I detailed the expired access agreement covering the exact footprint of the Seacliff Point main gate. Laura listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked only one question. Did she explicitly order you to vacate the premises on camera? Yes, I replied. I heard a sound on the other end of the line. It was the sharp, decisive click of an expensive pen cap snapping shut. Send me the footage. Send me the gate logs. But most importantly, send me the title map. I will have the injunction filed before they sit down for lunch. By noon, the legal machinery of reality crashed into Margaret Ellison's fantasy kingdom. Laura didn't just send an email. She deployed a multi-point legal blockade. Formal cease and desist notices were simultaneously served to the HOA board of directors, the management company, the private security contractor, and the title insurer. The language was devoid of any emotion. It was surgical. It cited unauthorized entry onto private property, attempted illegal removal of a lawful owner, gross misuse of security protocols, and the absolute killing blow, the immediate, unlicensed occupation of the Hayes Coastal Trust parcel by the community entrance gate. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Seacliff Point stopped feeling like a prestigious, untouchable community. It started feeling exactly like what it was, a panicked corporation realizing it had a massive, catastrophic liability sitting right on its front lawn. My phone, resting face down on the plywood workbench, began to vibrate constantly. The notifications stacked up like a digital car crash. There was an urgent message from the management company requesting a brief, informal call to clarify the morning's unfortunate misunderstanding. Then came a frantic email from the security contractor, begging me not to pursue formal trespassing charges while they reviewed their internal staff training. Margaret did not contact me. That was the first genuinely smart thing she had done all day. Or, more likely, Arthur the treasurer had finally terrified her into silence. The emergency board meeting was scheduled exactly 48 hours later. I didn't attend in person. I didn't want to give Margaret the satisfaction of a live target. I attended via video conference, sitting at my desk in the sprawling, unfinished library of my estate. The camera captured the raw, exposed wooden beams and the plastic sheeting behind me, a subtle, visual reminder that I didn't need to dress up to own the ground they walked on. The digital grid on my laptop screen illuminated the Seacliff Point clubhouse. It was a room that smelled virtually of polished walnut, ocean air, and incredibly expensive anxiety. Margaret sat at the absolute center of the long conference table. She wore a pale gray jacket. Her hands were folded perfectly in front of her. Her face was a masterclass in composed neutrality, but the high-definition camera caught the severe, tight pulse in her jaw every single time someone muttered the phrase, title review. Arthur Bell sat 2 chairs away. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. His tablet was lying flat on the table, and he refused to look at the camera lens. Daniel, the security guard, was not present, but his regional manager was. A square-jawed woman named Denise, who looked like she had read the morning's incident report 3 times and absolutely despised every single paragraph of it. Laura joined the call from her downtown office, looking as immovable and indifferent as a locked filing cabinet. The management company's attorney opened the floor, attempting to frame the incident as a regrettable breakdown in routine verification procedures. Laura stopped him before the sentence could even settle in the room. "Let the record reflect that there was no breakdown in procedure," Laura stated, her voice slicing through the laptop speakers. "My client was accurately verified by the gate software. The issue is not the system. The issue is that your HOA president consciously disregarded physical and digital evidence, trespassed onto a private estate, and attempted to illegally evict the lawful owner because she did not approve of his clothing." The silence in the clubhouse was heavy enough to crack the walnut table. Margaret leaned aggressively toward her microphone, unable to help herself. "That characterization is completely unfair. We acted in good faith on a severe security concern involving an unidentified person lurking inside a vacant legacy property." Laura didn't even blink. "He was unidentified, Margaret, because you never bothered to ask for his name before handing him a removal notice." I watched Margaret's perfectly manicured fingers press together so hard her knuckles turned entirely white. Without her marble foyer, without a compliant security guard standing behind her, without the ability to turn her posture into absolute power, she looked incredibly small. She looked like a middle manager caught doctoring an expense report. Denise, the security manager, leaned into the frame. "Effective immediately, our guards will no longer execute removal requests or approach any residents based solely on the visual suspicion of a board member. All future owner-related concerns must be routed through written legal channels." Margaret's head snapped toward the woman. "That renders our neighborhood security entirely useless." "No, Margaret," Denise replied coldly. "It renders it legal." I almost smiled. The liquidation was complete. Her own enforcement arm had just publicly stripped her of her authority. But Arthur had to address the actual bleeding wound. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses with a trembling hand. "Regarding the access parcel, the main gate." Laura shared her screen. A high-resolution scan of the title map appeared for everyone in the room to see. A bright, undeniable red outline hovered over the community's entrance road, the cobblestone turnaround, and the landscaped island. "The prior owner's temporary use license expired 18 months ago," Laura explained calmly. "Seacliff Point's current gate operation is entirely dependent on the continued, unlicensed use of land owned exclusively by the Hayes Coastal Trust." Nobody spoke. Through the large architectural windows of my library, I could look down the long slope of the hill and actually see the gate in question. Tiny luxury cars were gliding through it, completely oblivious to the fact that the asphalt beneath their tires was currently being held hostage in a video call. "That entrance has served this community for 2 decades, Margaret argued, her voice thinning out, desperately clinging to nostalgia. "Historic use matters. Written permission matters more," Laura countered flawlessly. "The settlement was swift, brutal, and entirely one-sided. I didn't ask them to tear the gate down. I am a businessman. I prefer cash flow over demolition." The management company agreed to draft a new, ironclad access license. The HOA would pay a premium monthly lease to use my asphalt. They would carry all the liability insurance. But there was one final condition. A condition Margaret fought against for 20 minutes before Arthur practically begged her to surrender. A formal letter of correction. By Friday afternoon, an email and a physical letter were delivered to every single homeowner in Seacliff Point. It detailed the new security protocols. It formally acknowledged my ownership of the 21,000-square-foot estate. It explicitly admitted the HOA's error in attempting an unauthorized removal. And it legally recognized that the community's primary entrance operated strictly under a lease agreement with my trust. Margaret Ellison resigned from the board quietly 3 days later. There was no grand farewell email. There was no going-away reception. She just stopped showing up. A week later, the estate finally felt like mine. The sun was beginning to set over the Pacific, casting long, golden ribbons of light across the ocean and spilling into the grand foyer. The smell of primer had faded, replaced by the clean scent of polished wood and sea salt. The contractors had left for the day, leaving the massive house in absolute, perfect silence. I stood by the front architectural windows, a cup of black coffee in my hand. I wore the exact same faded denim jeans and scuffed boots I had worn the day Margaret tapped her designer pin against my glass. I looked down the hill. The security gate was operating smoothly. Headlights swept across the cobblestones as residents returned to their multi-million-dollar sanctuaries, driving over an entrance they once thought they owned, paying a toll they never knew existed. Margaret had believed that power came from the ability to make other people feel small. She thought authority was a performance. But as the ocean crashed steadily against the cliffs below, unaffected and eternal, I was reminded of the only lesson that truly matters in this world. Loud power is just an illusion desperately begging for attention. Real power is the paperwork in the dark, waiting patiently for the arrogant to step over the line.